I'm just going to put some of my concerns again in this chamber. I do not intend to canvass all of my concerns, nor the issues that I think have to be properly addressed, no matter which way this bill goes. What I want to address are just 2 or 3 issues. I think it is wrong to say there are only 2 choices. There are many choices. Societies change every day, and we do not know what the children of the future need, what the children are experiencing today. We are not equipped fully in this chamber or elsewhere to really understand the various lifestyles and the situations that children find themselves in. Anyone who's worked in social services or in the family courts or had anything to do with pediatrics will tell you that every child is individual, every child has different needs, and not all the options are available to all children. For many years, it is true, we have talked about decriminalization. I think the public was engaged in decriminalization, and slowly I saw society move from saying that it is criminal to perhaps we should consider decriminalization, particularly for young people. But the government came very quickly to say legalization, using a term recreational marijuana as being acceptable. This raises the difficulty that many Canadians that have emailed me, and there's been hundreds, have confused decriminalization and legalization. It was really incumbent on the government to put forward fully and to address education before the bill. It would have made it much simpler. We don't know what will work to make society better. Is it legalization? Is it decriminalization? Is it staying where we are? Or are there other options? Other countries are exploring other options. So I do not say it was a failed policy and now we're going to have a good policy. The other policy may have failed. New policies may be just as much a failure in 5 to 10 years. That's why I think we need the education, and I think that is why the concerns have been raised. We cannot sit here and say we have the right option. What we can say is, if this bill is passed, we have a different option. But that's why we should have moved so cautiously. Education should have come first, and it is only now being addressed. I worry about the people in between the education. I don't believe alcohol and prohibition and then legalization is a good example. I do not go back to 1910 and 1920. Society is totally different. And what we learned is that we went along the way and changed our alcohol policies. But I look at one policy, the fetal alcohol syndrome, and what that has wrought. We weren't prepared, we weren't looking for the medical factors. And those of us who have had to work with children understand. And now I worry about the brain damage that young people will have according to the reports that are coming out. I believe the government has a right to introduce a law. They were, after all, elected by majority, and I submit that they have that right. But I also submit they have a responsibility as government to implement such high-risk programs, not as a work in progress, but as an alternative, and show us how it will be implemented so that we can embrace the law, we can be part of it. We are, in fact, in a democracy. Governments should be transparent and accountable. They should not just be transparent and accountable after the fact. I wish that we had more time to debate what Senator Lankin brought up. You know, we could learn from the past. We used to have white papers and green papers where they were disseminated to all the public, and the public could react long before the laws were implemented or drafted. And I'm afraid not only did we not get the information early enough, and I'm not talking about the Senate, I'm talking about the public at large, did not get the information early enough and did not get an opportunity to address their concerns. So that continues to be of great concern. How do we go from here? How are we going to educate the public? How are we going to deal with the issues? And one area that Senator Down has been preoccupied with, and so have I, is illegal activity. It is a worldwide phenomenon, and we can talk about stemming illegal activity by legalizing it here. Let me tell you, if you study the reports even in the OECD, in all of our security environments, you will know that the criminal activity is a step ahead of us. We know that in our cyber security, and we know that in illegal activity. Those of us who have worked in the criminal law system will tell you we will not eliminate illegal activity. We might slow it down. It may change. It will be with us, and we have to be ever vigilant. So there is no panacea for the illegal activity. Finally, the issues that I've already addressed, my concerns about international law, and I will continue to follow those up. And as I stated before, I'll state it again, we are in a very tenuous world with like-minded countries that we used to sit together with are now not as abiding by conventions they have signed or agreements or policies. And every little thread that rips apart a convention is not what we want from the value system we have and the international order that we have tried to build. My final point is the Senate has a responsibility under the Constitution for Aboriginal people. I take that responsibility very seriously. The Declaration on Indigenous People and our section in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not negotiable. It is a right. It is a right to the Aboriginal people. And I am somewhat concerned that we continue to say we will consult in the future. We will make a promise. I think the words that bothered me most in the letter from the minister was rest assured. We have rested assured so many times. I don't think our Aboriginal people deserve to have to wait. So the message today is, these are not rights we are giving the Aboriginal people. These are rights the Aboriginal people have. And we must do everything in this chamber to assure that they have them and not wait for another day. Thank you.
Very good. Question? Senator Bove, you have a question?
Yes, will Senator Andrewtuck take a question?
Please.
On the international aspect, and as you know, I said the other night a number of bills are before Congress and that we're obviously in a changing society. Well, it changed today. There was a bill put before both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, which I'm sure you've seen. And these bills would protect the states that legalize marijuana from federal interference, allowing individuals and businesses acting in compliance with state marijuana laws to operate without the threat of federal prosecution. I would be very interested to know how you think that might ameliorate or help move the world forward as countries around the world are changing their cannabis laws.
Senator Andrewtuck.
I'd make two comments. One is that the President has been on record to say that he would allow the states to do what they wish, but he's also said perhaps not, as we know. But we heard absolutely in two committees that the federal position on the border will not change, has not changed. So these laws, in my opinion, unless there is something in them in detail, are about not federal interference into the states, but they maintain their jurisdiction at the border. So I think that is where that issue stands. I would dispute one thing. There are countries moving towards changes of their positions on marijuana. But there are equally countries moving in the opposite direction, as we know. And that's what bothers me about the international order. We would have seen like-minded moving in one direction, and then we would see, how do we bring more people onto it? Well, our drug conventions have about 180 participants in them. Some of them want change, and we're going to the WHO to see, are there alternatives? But there are others that are maintaining their position, and in fact, strengthening it. So we are, again, not at any consensus in that area. That is why, to me, my emphasis, yes, I think we violated the laws. I am very, very sorry that we did that. That decision must have been taken a year or two ago. What concerns me is, what is our plan to reinforce the international order and what we stand for? Because I don't believe that Canada, or this government for that matter, wishes to not reinforce the international order.
Senator Bovey?
Just very quickly, the fact that this was a bipartisan bill in both places, does my colleague, honourable colleague, feel that this might make dialogue make dialogue easier as we move forward into these new times?
Senator Anderson.
I'm not sure that the United States will be the key. The United States on international matters enters into the discussions, but it is not the first to sign on, either changes or otherwise. It's interesting, many of the international conventions that have been signed, the United States is not a signatory to. But you will see that some parts of the United States in their composition will move to support them. So I'm not sure, and I wouldn't hazard a guess anyway of what is going on in the United States.
Senatrice Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable colleagues, I had a speech prepared today with wonderful statistics and relevant quotes and many arguments. And this morning I woke up and said to myself, really, what more can I say? We have studied, we have reflected and spoken about this bill for months now.
So this will be a very short speech. I have talked and taught about cannabis more in the last few months than in my whole life. And at this point, if I'm not ready, I will never be. There's only so much preparation you need before it's time to cross that finish line, no matter how scary that is. I believe that, and it's personal, I believe that the best moments, performances, and decisions happen when our head, our heart, and our guts are saying the same thing, are in sync. But to me, that is pretty much impossible in this case when it's so complex and with yet so many unknown. And this, I believe, is a challenge that many of us face with this bill. But after months of speeches, over 100 of witnesses sharing their expertise and countless hours just thinking about it, because we know we can't get it wrong, my head tells me that decriminalization is public health. It is protecting our youth. It matters, and there is urgency in making it happen. Adults who choose to consume cannabis should have access to legal, regulated, well-labeled products. Legalization will enable proper data collection and therefore better understanding of this substance and its arms. My head tells me that this bill, with our strong amendments and very thoughtful, relevant observations, is restrictive enough to protect the most vulnerable. but my heart still worries. I know more than ever before that this bill alone will not be enough, that public education and awareness has been insufficient, and that it will be, in my opinion, the single most important key to success. In the last few days, there were amendments proposed by some colleagues that really resonated with me. Sénatrice Poirier, je crois comme
Senator Poirier, I believe, like you do, that the medical data shows that older people know best when it's an issue of being exposed to cannabis, and all of our young adults should know that and be aware of it.
Secondhand smoke, and I too believe that when it comes to cannabis, the harm is underknown and underappreciated. In fact, when you told the story of growing up in a house where your parents smoked, it brought back memories. I too grew up with two heavy smoking parents. They started when they were 15. They smoke in the house, in the car. And there's even a picture of my mom with, in one arm, my younger baby brother, and in one hand, a cigarette from 30 years ago. She still smoked. But you know what? And you know what? When I had my son 4 years ago, the first time she visited us, I didn't even have to ask her. She just spontaneously went outside to smoke because she knows how harmful it is. And this year, she started vaping and plans to stop by the end of the year. That, to me, is the great power of public education and awareness, and yes, for sure, a bit of pressure from me, but I truly believe that with very strong, diverse, long-term awareness campaigns, I believe that social change can happen and that we can have the impact that we will need. My heart still wonders if we're just putting a lid on a problem instead of going to the roots of it. In all the questions, the one answer that I never got, and that was the most important to me, is this bill going to have a positive impact on decreasing significantly Canadian youth consumption? No witnesses, and I think everybody agrees with that, has come forward saying that it will have a significantly impact in decreasing. And that, to me, is very concerning. I know that some of my colleagues do not think that it's that big a problem, but I continue to believe that it is very disturbing that our youth are among the highest cannabis users in the world. And I continue to believe that legalization alone will not address this. Depuis que nous avons commencé à étudier ce projet de loi,
Since we started studying this bill, I became fascinated by the Icelandic model. In 1998, the situation of young people in Iceland was disastrous, and they decided to do something drastic to deal with this problem audaciously. And in 2016, so less than 20 years later, the results are remarkable.
Legalization, teens using cannabis went from, and we're talking 15 and 16 years old, went from 17% to 7% in less than 20 years. In 1998, 42% of teens said that they had been drunk in the previous month, and that rate dropped to only 5% in 2016. It's not by miracle that this happened. That very small country has particularly eradicated the abuse of alcohol, tobacco, and drugs among its young people because they understood that social problems are products of a social environment and that the solution lies in the creation of an environment that does not produce an opportunity or desire for substance abuse. They went from what they call artificial highs and addictions to natural highs like sport, art, and music. le gouvernement islandais a lancé un
The Icelandic government launched a program called Youth in Iceland, which combines curfews, prevention, the support of the majority, and above all, subsidies to encourage sports and the practice of sports, access to all, to arts and music as well. This Icelandic program also focuses on more closeness, attention, and sharing within the family. The Icelandic method even inspired a European project called Youth in Europe, which has already had wonderful results. And I can hear you thinking, honorable colleagues, yes, but Iceland, with its 340,000 people, is small. It's not Canada.
But I can't help thinking, why not? And what if, as a country, we decided to commit to a vision like this? Why not be ambitious? What if we chose to invest the same amount of efforts, time, and resources we devoted to legalizing cannabis in a deep social change for our youth? We may never know the answer because it's not the choice we have decided to make. Yet a small country like Iceland has made drastic, inspiring choices when it came to solving a serious problem of drug use among young people. And that choice led to result. So in conclusion, let me quote briefly two great Canadians, Mark Tewksbury and our colleague Senator Manning. My dear friend, Mark Tewksbury, when he was dreaming of winning the gold medal in Barcelona '92, kept repeating himself, someone's gonna be the best in the world, so why not me? Why not me? And I think some country is gonna be the best in the world when it comes to youth being healthy, thriving, with no limits to what they choose to accomplish. Someone's gonna do it, so why not us? Why not Canada? And as Senator Manning said in his very inspiring speech on May 31, every journey begins with a single step. So let's hope that Bill C-45 is indeed this first step, but most importantly, let's commit to making sure that the journey will not stop at this first step.
Senator Omidvar.
Thank you, Speaker. It's tough to follow that one, but I will try. Clearly, C-45 is a bill that will change in some significant way the narrative of this country. And it seems to me every June, since I've been here, we've been in these same discussions about bills that change the narrative of our country. The first June I came, it was C-14, the assisted dying bill. The next June, that was last year, we were dealing with C-16, which was the transgendered rights bill. And so this June, we are dealing with the cannabis bill. So I think just a word of orientation for our new colleagues who've come in the last few weeks. June is never a dull month in the Senate. I also want to take the opportunity to thank two very hardworking people who have dealt with all our suggestions and ideas, and these are our two law clerks. I was not aware that we only had two law clerks to deal with the plethora of amendments that we are making, not just on C-45, but on C-49, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if two is enough, but I'll leave that for others to decide. All I would like to do is to make sure they get a vote of thanks from us as well. Yes. So, to get back to C-45, I'm likely, like many Canadians, I wish that people did not consume alcohol to the extent that they become a danger to themselves and to others. I wish they did not smoke at all, because we know of the health harms associated with tobacco. I wish the same for cannabis, but I don't think we can turn the clock back. Alcohol, tobacco, cannabis are facts of life. What we can do instead of wishful thinking is to legislate, regulate, and monitor such that the health of individuals and communities is not at risk. This because, and I will quote many other senators who've spoken before me, because prohibition does not work. I grew up in a country where, depending on the government in power, alcohol was prohibited at different stages of my childhood. I remember this very distinctly. My father, who never had soup at home, we would go to a restaurant and he would order soup. And I would say, what's he doing? He doesn't drink soup. Until one day I peered into the bowl, and of course, it was scotch and soda. And I said to him, do you even know what that is? And he shrugged his shoulders. So prohibition serves only one purpose within this context. It is to grow and secure an illicit market. The illicit market is $6 billion worth. And I'm using the word illicit market very carefully and very knowingly, as opposed to the commonly used words black market, because I have been educated by our colleague Senator Bernard on this matter, and I understand the sensitivities around it, and I can't promise not to slip up. But I'm at least aware of what those two words can mean to a community that is already, especially within the context of cannabis, so heavily and disproportionately impacted. What I worry most about the illicit market is, yes, it destroys lives, and it destroys families, and it destroys communities. But I think what is really scary is that young people are brought into touch with criminal elements, and thus possibly normalizing criminal activities in their eyes, and who knows, maybe even facilitating their entry into criminal activity. I also think of the only way I can think at this point: how do adults purchase cannabis as long as it is illegal? So, I can only think of one source. You go to your dealer or to a dealer, and the dealer is part of an organized crime food chain. We know that. And so you call up your dealer, and I'm imagining this. I've watched enough television shows to be quite vivid in my imagination. So you stand at the corner of a street, someone gives you a bag or a baggie full of stuff. You don't know what it is. You don't know what's in it. You don't know whether it has THC or CBD. And I think the worst danger of all, you actually don't know whether, you can maybe get it delivered at home. I don't know, Senator Monsieur, but you don't know what's in it, and worse, you don't know whether it is laced with something harmful, and this is what really worries me. So it is literally like buying a pig in a poke. So once legalization is the norm, you will go into a store, I imagine, or online. You will purchase a product. It is labeled. You know what you're getting. You know its potency levels. There may be warnings on it, et cetera, et cetera. And you can be guaranteed that it will be not laced with a harmful substance. I want to move on to another aspect of the illicit market and its impact on the consumer. We've heard a great deal in the chamber and at committee about the life-changing impact of criminalization. A youth indiscretion for simple possession leaves a lifelong imprint. And as Senator Poirier pointed out yesterday, these harms include stigmatization, exclusion, limited opportunities for meaningful employment, therefore worsening levels of poverty and poor health outcomes, all while exhausting limited public resources. We have also heard at length about the disproportionate impact of criminalization on two historically excluded groups: Indigenous peoples and African Canadians. Senator Dick reminded us that in Regina, Indigenous people are 9 times more likely to be criminalized for simple possession compared to others. In Toronto, where I come from, in the 10 years between 2003 and 2013, Toronto police arrested black people at 3 times the rate of white people for minor cannabis possession, and this despite data that shows similar rates of cannabis use among these communities. So once again, criminalization has contributed to overrepresentation in our prison system for excluded groups. I, for one, do not want to see another Indigenous person or African Canadian or racial minority or, in fact, any other Canadian face a prison sentence for mere simple possession. But this does not complete my thoughts on this, because there are fears, and we do have fears, and let me move on to some of these fears. And I think we've heard a lot of people talk about the potential harm done by cannabis consumption among youth and the impact on their brain development. And we've heard from so many different witnesses, and quite frankly, the evidence is contradictory. And based on which point of view we have, we will cite the evidence that supports our point of view. But I don't deny that there is a potential for harm. I take some comfort from the witness statement of Ian Culbert from the Canadian Public Health Association, who told us that only 1% of students in grades 7 to 12 reported using cannabis daily in the past 12 months. And this is the key. It depends on how soon in life you start using cannabis and how often you use it. Now, I will say 1% is not insignificant. We have to be worried about the 1%. But we cannot and we can't ignore this harm. But we also heard again and again and again in witness statement that legalization will help the scientific community do more research. They will finally be able to do the research because people will be admitting to using a legal substance as opposed to an illegal substance. And so then we will be able to find out, in a more scientific way, I hope, what is the association with heavy use, age, mental health, and other health conditions. And once we know this, we can develop strategies and interventions based on evidence as opposed to fear and speculation. There are other reasonable fears. Will use among young people go up? Frankly, I don't know if it will or if it won't. But again, I look at evidence from south of the border. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health from Colorado found that in Colorado, use did not go up. In fact, it dropped a little for young people aged 12 and 17. In Washington, the State Liquor and Cannabis Board found that in their Healthy Use Survey that use had not gone up in 2012 and 2016, and they have a very sort of a scientific survey where they ask the same question to grade 8, 10, and 12 every 2 years. So I suspect the sky will not fall in if this bill is passed. In fact, there is reason to be confident, colleagues. 2 days ago, a new survey was published by Deloitte, and it found that 2/3 of Canadian cannabis users say they will switch to legal retailers. And the reasons for the switch is better choice, better quality products, and safety. They're also prepared, by the way, to pay a slightly higher price in exchange for a product that is not illegal, that is safe, and that is regulated. So I feel more confident that the passage of this bill will achieve its objectives. In conclusion, I want to make a few comments about the process that we have gone through. I want to thank and commend Senators Harder, Smith, Wu, and Day for coming up with this process that has allowed us, in a timely, efficient, and non-truncated manner, to dig deep into these issues and participate in the debate in a fulsome and timely manner. Well done. I would wish that we follow the same process, perhaps informally, for the next little while, and maybe we can actually formalize it in some time. Okay? I also want to thank, I really want to thank Senator Eggleton for the expert and elegant way. He took us, he took members of the Social Affairs Committee through a very complex matter in a fair manner. And of course, Senator Seidman and Senator Petitclerc, who joined hands to make sure that every member of the Social Affairs Committee was included. And finally, I want to say thank you. I think I owe personally a huge debt of gratitude to you, Senator Dean, and I think we all owe you a huge debt of gratitude and appreciation for the absolutely outstanding job you have done. You have set a bar that is very hard for others to follow. Thank you very much.
Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take this opportunity to make a few comments on Bill C-45. I would like to preface my remarks by saying that last month I marked the 25th anniversary of my first election to the House of Assembly in Newfoundland and Labrador, which took place in 1993. During the past 25 years, I have had the privilege of being a member in the legislature of Newfoundland and Labrador, served in the House of Commons, and now have the honour to continue to serve with all of you here in the Senate of Canada. I have sat as a member of the opposition, a member of the governing party, and for a period of time, I even sat as an independent. I have learned many valuable lessons throughout the years and have come to expect and have come to accept and respect the opinion of others, even if they are totally different from mine. I have learned that people look at the world with different lenses, and in our case, here in this chamber, review proposed legislation from a variety of perspectives, which is everyone's right to do so. I have also learned and lived through the pressures that are brought to bear by the governing party to support legislation which you may not feel 100% comfortable with at the time. From the many discussions I have had during the past several weeks, I believe this piece of legislation to be a prime example of that. But at the end of the day, we all have a choice to make. We all will make a personal decision to support or not support a bill as, in this case, with Bill C-45. While I may not agree with the decision of many others in this chamber who will be supporting this bill, I do respect their right to do so, and in turn I ask that you respect my right to vehemently oppose this piece of legislation. As a member of the Social Affairs Committee, I sat and listened to many witnesses who came before us in support of or against this bill. I spent many late evenings in my office poring over reports, studies and testimonies, as well as talking to people throughout different parts of my province and indeed the country. Following on those efforts, I have reached my own conclusion that this is a piece of legislation which I believe is not in the best interest of Canadians at the present time. There have been many presentations made on this very important bill, and as always, supported on both sides with what are deemed to be the facts. However, I still have many questions and concerns. When you hear arguments made in support of a piece of legislation substantiated by a comprehensive study from a reputable group or organisation, or supported by a massive polling exercise which tells you that the margin of error is plus or minus 1%, and then the very next day you hear the arguments against the same piece of legislation, substantiated by a comprehensive study from a reputable group or organisation, and again supported by another massive polling exercise, which tells you once again that the margin of error is plus or minus 1%. One is often left wondering which side to believe. Who was right? Who was wrong? Who was telling the truth? And more importantly, who was not? Well, in my experience, I have also learned that if your pockets are deep enough and the question is posed in a certain way, you can receive whatever answer you desire to the question you are asking. Therefore, is there a right or wrong? That is not a question I can answer for someone else. I can only do that for myself. Based on what I have read and listened to, and based on what I have had laid before me on Bill C-45, I cannot and will not be supporting this bill. I want to put forward here today that I'm a strong supporter of medical marijuana. I feel that if any person in consultation with their doctor decides the use of marijuana will bring relief to their suffering, that is their choice, and I support that. I was extremely upset to learn that Bill C-45 will impose a tax on medical marijuana, while other prescription drugs country are not taxed. It begged the question in my mind, is the purpose of this bill all about the money and the rest are just words? I am also a big supporter of decriminalisation of marijuana. We were all teenagers at one time and we all made mistakes. None of us are perfect, and I do not believe we should have to live with those childish and immature mistakes for the rest of our lives. To have a lifelong criminal record for being caught with 3 joints of weed when you were 16 or 17 years of age was and remains ridiculous. I am not convinced that Bill C-45 addresses the follies of youth in a fully constructive and productive manner. After thoroughly studying this proposed bill, I have come to the conclusion that this is not that well thought out. I understand the importance of a government striving to live up to a major election promise. I understand the desire for all levels of government to cash in on the tax revenue that will be derived from the sale of marijuana. But I truly and honestly believe that the health and social costs derived from the implementation of this bill will far outweigh any economic benefits generated from the tax revenue which will be collected. Let me state some of the concerns I have with this piece of legislation. According to the government, one of the intentions of this bill is to take marijuana out of the hands of kids, while at the same time Bill C-45 allows children ages 12 to 17 to possess up to 5 grams of marijuana. Whereas I understand the decriminalisation angle to this piece of the legislation, I do not believe possession of marijuana should be permitted by any child aged 12 to 17. I am a believer in zero tolerance at such a young age because of the medical evidence of the harm it can cause to youth. There has to be a better way to address this very important concern. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health has reviewed the evidence on cannabis control and drawn the following conclusions. Cannabis use carries significant health risks, especially for people who use it frequently and or begin to use it at an early age. Medical professionals from the Canadian Medical Association have testified that the brain continues to develop until age 25. Increased use before the age of 25 increases one's risk of developing mental disorders such as schizophrenia, depression and anxiety by up to 30% compared to those who have not used marijuana under the age of 25. Dr. Jeff Blackmore from the Canadian Medical Association also appeared before the Health Committee to testify and spoke specifically to how this government is not taking the medical advice on marijuana very seriously. He stated, "We've been a little surprised that people haven't been more respectful of the evidence and the real potential for danger. These are not theoretical lab models. These are studies, and we know that the earlier people start, the greater the damage, the more permanent it is, and the greater the likelihood of becoming addicted to marijuana. We have all the statistics. We have all the evidence we need in terms of the effects on education, career attainment, IQ levels, and all of these types of things. Yet we keep hearing that we need to keep it consistent with the age of alcohol. Again, to us, this argument doesn't hold water. The Insurance Brokers of Canada have also raised serious concerns about how the legislation will affect home and auto insurance, especially about the amount of marijuana which can be consumed before driving a vehicle in order to maintain insurance policies. Whether marijuana plants being grown in a home will affect the homeowner's insurance rates, or even if they will be able to maintain their insurance as well, is a concern. The Canadian Real Estate Association has raised their concerns about the implications and consequences of personal cultivation for houses and homeowners, including health and safety issues, questions regarding homeowner rights, enhanced disclosure requirements, effective oversight, and the enforcement of legal and illegal homegrown operations. They stated that their strong preference is that no personal cultivation of cannabis be allowed in the home. These organisations I mentioned and several others witnesses stressed the importance of having a public awareness, public education program in place prior to legalisation. There are no provisions in this bill for public education, and the government's efforts so far on this front leave much to be desired. We heard from several witnesses as well, especially from those involved in law enforcement, that the lack of a proper scientific method to detect any drug-impaired driver is a major concern. Many expressed the view that they have not received the tools or the training to keep our highways and citizens safe. That should be a concern for all of us. Knowing the very serious issues which Aboriginal communities in the Labrador region of my province and elsewhere in this country have experienced throughout the years, I am shocked and appalled when I see that vitally important amendments put forward by the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples were rejected by the majority and reduced to observations in the final report by the Standing Committee on Social Affairs. In my humble opinion, this was a grave error in judgment and indeed a lost opportunity. Important issues were raised, such as the lack of consultation with Indigenous communities and organisations in the development of Bill C-45, the lack of culturally specific public education materials on the legislation pertaining to the legalisation of cannabis and on the health effects of cannabis, the lack of access to and funding for culturally specific mental health and addiction services, an imperative for action recognising the inherent rights of Indigenous communities to exercise jurisdiction over the regulation, sale, consumption and taxation of cannabis in their communities, and the desire from Indigenous communities to fully participate in the economic opportunities and own resource revenue potential occasioned by the legalisation of cannabis. In all my time dealing with committee reports, regardless of who holds the reins of power here in Ottawa, it is difficult at most times to have a minister, a department and/or a government to act upon good, solid and well thought out recommendations from this place. The record of all governments, of all political stripes, in dealing with and acting upon these recommendations, which have been reduced to observations, is dismal on all fronts. It is considered by many as a slap in the face to the hard work and time we all put into our committee work. I understand from the news media yesterday that the government has promised to deal with these issues and to put the necessary human and financial resources in place to deal with the concerns brought forward through the work and recommendations of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. My friends, we all know promises and legislation have distinct differences. A promise can be broken, lost and not delivered on a variety of reasons, for a variety of reasons, including budgetary restraints, change of government, or even something as simple as a change of a minister. So please, I encourage everyone in this chamber to do our part to keep the feet of the government to the fire on these important issues. Only with the passage of time will we know the true commitment of the government. So please, do not allow the talking points to get in the way of what really needs to be done for the health and safety of our Aboriginal communities. I also put forward the concerns expressed by several provinces that they will be given the necessary time to prepare for the legalisation of marijuana. I know the government has spoken about this, but there is a fear in many provinces that they are not fully prepared for all the issues that will arise when this bill becomes the law of the land. So I stress the need for restraint on that front as well, along with the resources that will be required. Colleagues, there are many sections of this bill which concern me, but time does not allow me today to expand on all of those. As I said earlier in my remarks, I spent many hours studying and being part of the discussions on this very important piece of legislation. I drew my own conclusion that I could not support Bill C-45 at this time and in its present format. I believe it would be poor public policy because many parts of our country, especially the more remote areas, are not prepared for the changes that are about to happen. I did not support any of the amendments from any side because, in my honest opinion, the bill reminds me of a large bucket of salty water, and regardless of the efforts to throw in a few glasses of fresh water, the original bucket of salty water still remains. I believe this piece of legislation to be probably one of the largest policy shifts in Canada in quite some time, and maybe only one of the very few which we will ever deal with in this chamber that has the potential to change the face of our country in such a paramount way. And in my opinion, may I add that I do not believe that the changes we will witness with the passage of this bill will be for the betterment of Canada and Canadians. As a matter of fact, I strongly believe otherwise. I have seen and witnessed what drug use can do to family and friends. I have seen firsthand the destruction of lives of good, honest, hard-working people. I can only hope today that the revenue from the taxes collected on the sale of marijuana will be put into education programs, especially for our youth, and to assist with addictions and mental health issues throughout our country, and more particularly in more remote locations. I want to thank all those who have contributed in any way to the important debate and discussion on Bill C-45, especially those who sat on the several different committees dealing with the different elements of this bill, and more so to Senator Eglinton, Senator Seidman and Senator Perry-Clare for their work at the Social Affairs. It has taken much time and deliberation, and you are all to be commended for your efforts. To the sponsor of the bill, Senator Dean, I say congratulations on your work as well, even with all the personal health issues you had to deal with. While I spoke to you several times and told you that I did not agree with this bill, our conversations were always respectful and constructive, even when I knew my personal views were not making any impact. We all have a choice to make on what we believe in our hearts and souls to be the best interests of all those that we have the privilege to serve. As I said at the beginning, I respect your right to vote how you desire, and I ask you to respect my right to do so as well.
Senator Batters. Senator Batters.
Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak on third reading of Bill C-45. Let me begin by saying that I am concerned about the uncharted future into which this legislation leads us. Colleagues, Canada is just not ready to legalize marijuana. The police, the provinces, municipalities, the overburdened healthcare and justice systems, they are just not ready for a sudden policy shift of this magnitude, rushed under the pressure of a government dead set on meeting an arbitrary deadline for its own political reasons. When Bill C-45 was first proposed, there were many questions to be answered. This bill has been before Parliament for more than a year. Here we are at third reading in the Senate, and then there are even more unanswered questions now than when we began our study. How will law enforcement be able to enforce home cultivation laws? When will roadside drug detection machines finally be selected? What are the implications for Canadians at the US border once marijuana is legalized in Canada? How is it going to be handled in Aboriginal communities that don't want any part of it? What about the international anti-drug treaties Canada has signed? At what price will the government set marijuana? Is that low enough to avoid the growth of the black market? The questions are endless. What's disturbing is that the very architects of this legislation can't answer some of these most basic questions at this point in the process. The officials in charge of drafting and implementing this bill can't even explain some of its provisions adequately. I told you in my report stage speech about my experience about asking Department of Justice, Public Safety and Health officials at committee for clarification about the provisions of Section 81E in this bill. This provision is regarding the number of budding or flowering plants an individual is prohibited from possessing. The officials could not agree among themselves. The justice official said the clause referred to budding and flowering plants in public, even though the words in public were not present in that clause or in any clause that referred to Section 81E. I pointed this out and asked them to provide further clarification. None was forthcoming. When Senator Manning asked those same justice officials the same question at Social Affairs Committee 2 months later, he got still the same erroneous answer they had tried to provide me with 2 months earlier. This simply isn't good enough, honourable senators. Canadians deserve to know with certainty whether or not they will be breaking the criminal law of Canada if they grow 1 or 4 or 6 marijuana plants that are budding or flowering in their homes. It seems like this government has made a drafting error on a basic section of this bill that will impact a large number of Canadians, yet they refuse to admit it. It wasn't even one of the unprecedented 29 amendments the government made to its own legislation through its proxy, Senator Dean. The government has had 2.5 years to get this legislation right, honourable senators. It concerns me greatly that we are still finding holes in the legislation at this late point in the game. In the past few days, senators have moved amendments to address some of the problems with Bill C-45. I am relieved to see at least a few measures passed which will tighten up some of the more liberal provisions in this bill. Senator Seidman's proposal to limit branded advertising swag, for example, or Senator Plett's restrictions on social sharing. Yet I can't help feeling that it's not enough. We have an opportunity now to mitigate the damage of marijuana legalization before it becomes law, and I'm afraid we have largely missed it. First, because the Senate voted down a measure to prohibit home cultivation, and secondly, because it voted down the proposals to raise the age limit to 21 years of age for access to marijuana. These two measures would have at least helped to lessen the impact of this legislation on children and young adults, something to which this Trudeau government pays lip service but doesn't bear out in its actions. From the beginning, This government has told Canadians that the whole purpose behind this legislation is to keep marijuana out of the hands of kids. It is illogical that the Trudeau government's legalization scheme will do that. With 18-year-olds able to legally purchase pot, there will be a conduit for marijuana right into high schools. And now, with the social sharing proposal, teens as young as 16 will be able to access marijuana from their friends. Further, as legalization leads to the normalization of marijuana, usage among young people will increase. Honourable Senators, we had an extensive discussion yesterday in this chamber about the mental health repercussions of marijuana use, particularly on the developing brains of youth under 25. This remains my primary concern about this bill. Since we first began studying this bill in the Senate, it has been patently obvious that mental health concerns about legalization do not similarly preoccupy this Trudeau government. When I asked the Health Minister in the Senate's Committee of the Whole in this very chamber about the significant mental health implications of marijuana legalization, she gave me an almost 2-minute answer without once saying the words mental health. That is very telling, Honourable Senators, and deeply troubling. Medical professionals are overwhelmingly warning against this. We should be heeding their call. The mental health care system in Canada is woefully inadequate right now, yet this government is pushing through the legalization of a psychotropic drug with significant mental health consequences. Especially concerning is the impact this will have on children's mental health services. Currently, only 1 out of every 5 children who need mental health services receives them. We can expect youth usage to rise after legalization, and with it, the pressures on the youth mental health system will intensify as marijuana becomes normalized and increasingly available to young people. Canada's addictions treatment infrastructure is also not ready to deal with an increase of marijuana addictions stemming from legalization. Psychiatrist and Professor Dr. Philip Thibault testified before the Senate Social Affairs Committee, quote, "There are treatments for cannabis addictions. Is it available, and are people trained across the country in both urban and rural locations? Not at this date. But if you ask me today whether we are ready to deal with cannabis abuse and dependence from a treatment angle, no, we're not ready at this point. There has to be a lot of capacity building and also some research as to what are good treatment options," quote. I do not support the legalization of marijuana. I'm sure that comes as a surprise to no one. But if legalization is to proceed, it should not be in this current form, a bill that prominent defense lawyer Solomon Friedman has referred to as a, quote, hot mess of confusion. Yet it seems this Trudeau government intends to steamroll ahead with this flawed piece of legislation, consequences be damned, to meet his political deadline. In fact, Honourable Senators, everything about this bill has been dictated by Prime Minister Trudeau's political ambitions. This was obvious right from the start when Bill C-45 was introduced in the House of Commons on the last sitting day immediately before 4:20 to ensure that the thousands of marijuana smokers who converge on Parliament Hill each year would be happy with the Trudeau government they had voted in. The Trudeau government had just broken their electoral promise only weeks before, and they needed to promise their young voters something else to distract from that fallout. Well, I can tell you, Honourable Senators, the fallout for Canadians from this political decision to legalize marijuana will be enormous. We will not be able to put this genie back in the bottle. For the reasons I have outlined, I will be voting against Bill C-45 at third reading. I asked you to reflect deeply on the repercussions this legislation will have on youth, mental health, and the safety of all Canadians, and I hope that you will join me in voting against it. Thank you.
Senatrice Dupuy.
Senator Dupuy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today at third reading of Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act, adopted by the House of Commons on the 27th of November and amended by the Senate on the 30th. This is a tangible expression of an undertaking of the current Government of Canada, undertaken during the electoral campaign of 2015, which sought sweep into power, an undertaking to legalize and stringently regulate cannabis. Whatever our personal position on cannabis and the legalization of cannabis, I feel that we have carefully studied this bill. We have carried out a good deal of research, and we have been supported by the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Senator Beaning, whom I would like to thank for his research. We've had a chance to hear a great number of witnesses from varying backgrounds. These witnesses have appeared before many of the Senate standing committees, and finally before the Senate Standing Committee on Science, Technology, and Social Affairs. We were able to get answers to a number of questions we asked them, and we have come to the following conclusions. We are aware that we are not the first parliamentarians of Canada to study the matter of cannabis use since the 1970s, and we know that cannabis is a very complex matter. We know that cannabis is held to be the most commonly used drug, most commonly produced and sold in the world, and that it is used in nearly every country. We know that cannabis use is widespread in Canada, especially among youth, and that the illicit and booming market is such that there is no restriction on the content of the products now used. We know that cannabis use can lead to adverse effects for those who use it, especially when they use it at an early age and they use it frequently. We know that the use and sale of cannabis raises a number of public health concerns. We know that the science on cannabis use and current research on cannabis in Canada are lacking, and that we have a lot of catching up to do before we can accurately monitor the new situation that will be created by adopting Bill C-45. We will need to make up for a lack of data that would be necessary to provide a solid basis for decisions that will need to be taken to enforce the law. We know that the legalization of cannabis use under C-45 falls within a legal system that at present allows for the cultivation and use of cannabis and derivatives of cannabis by people who are ill to relieve their pain. We know how important it would be to overhaul the current system under which a person can be allowed to cultivate cannabis for medical purposes. We also know that the current regime regarding cannabis has been affected by decisions taken in Canadian courts since the year 2000 in matters of medical use. We know that cannabis has been discussed, has been subjected to judicial challenges, regulation. There's been an ongoing dialogue between these three branches of our state, the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches, and that for a number of years. We know that in the 60s, dried cannabis was used, only part of the plant was used, but now an almost infinite number of consumer products are made from different parts of the plant that can be smoked, vaped, drunk, eaten, applied on the body, and so forth, in concentrations that are much higher in THC than the cannabis that was used 50 years ago. We know how important it would be to regulate the sale and promotion of the products that would be legal, and how important it would be to regulate what would be legal to ensure that young people will not be targeted and that the availability of products is not confused with their safety. We know that there are a number of international issues given Canada's international undertakings. We know that this Canadian government law, if it is carried, would be interlinked with a number of provincial and territorial laws which would regulate some of the aspects of its application. We know that a number of provinces and territories have already specified what their priorities are and that they are ready to undertake legislation of their own. That's why the senators of the Independent Senators Group wanted to make recommendations to the effect that this be recognized, and it was unanimously accepted by the members of the committee. In this wise, I propose to my colleagues of the Independent Senators Group an amendment to clarify the jurisdiction of provinces to legislate on the cultivation of cannabis at home and the ability to forbid it. And this was discussed by the Independent Senators Group at the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and it was adopted. So it is the third amendment bringing a new Section 5.2 to Bill 45, carried by the Senate on the 30th of May last. I would like to point out how important the work of the president of that committee has been, Senator Eagleton, and also salute the activity of the two vice presidents, Petitclerc and Seidman, who had to link their overall study of the bill to the studies that were carried out by the other standing committees of the Senate, which had also been mandated to study certain parts of the bill. We have understood how important it would be to draw up prevention programs, to educate youth, and also to educate parents and school people. We understand how important it will be to specify socially that people who are ill can certainly use it as for medical purposes, but we need to avoid causing serious health problems to those who use it.
We have understood that it is our responsibility to ensure that young people in our society are adequately informed. And finally, we have the responsibility as adults to go beyond the stage of denial, of indifference, and of trivialization that has been maintained by the current regime of prohibition of cannabis. With this vote, we will have to be vigilant and analyze the report that the government will have to table in the Senate once it has reviewed the legislation 5 years from now, as Clause 51 obliges it to do so. Thank you.